She is the unstable one in this family, my sister Jasmine told the officers as the cold steel of handcuffs locked tightly around my wrists. For 2 decades, she spun a web of deception, and our parents swallowed every single lie just to protect their precious social standing. But as I sat in that interrogation room, accused of a $95,000 theft I did not commit, I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply looked at the detective and asked him to open the folder I had been meticulously building since I was 12 years old. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who desperately underestimated your worth. The sharp clink of metal echoing through the pristine glass walls of my corporate accounting firm was a sound I never expected to hear. It was 10 in the morning on a Tuesday. At 35 years old, I had worked relentlessly to build my career. I was a senior forensic accountant at one of Atlanta's most prestigious financial firms, a Black woman who had fought tooth and nail for her corner office. I was standing by my mahogany desk reviewing a massive corporate audit when 2 grim-faced detectives marched straight through my door. But the police were not the most shocking part of the intrusion. Right behind them, marching in like a tragic choir assembled for a very public performance, stood my family. My older sister Jasmine led the pack. At 37, she was the head of our church's finance committee and the undisputed golden child of the family. She was dressed impeccably in a tailored cream suit, clutching a designer tissue to her perfectly contoured face. Behind her was my father, Deacon Calvin, wearing his Sunday best suit on a weekday, his posture radiating a practiced heavy shame. Beside him stood my mother, Patricia, her hands clasped tightly together in a display of performative prayer, her face a mask of manufactured grief. Before the detectives could even read me my rights, Jasmine pushed past them. She placed a trembling hand on the glass desk of my managing partner, who had rushed out of his office to see what the commotion was about. "I am so incredibly sorry for this disruption," Jasmine sobbed, her voice perfectly pitched so that every junior analyst on the open floor could hear her. "We had absolutely no idea she was capable of this, embezzling $95,000 from our church's building fund. It breaks my heart. We tried to get her help. We really did." My managing partner stared in stunned silence. The entire floor had stopped typing. Dozens of eyes were locked on me. I stood there feeling the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into my wrists, but I kept my breathing slow and measured. I had spent my entire life watching my family prioritize respectability politics over the truth. They lived and breathed for the approval of the congregation, the country club, and their elite social circles. I knew exactly what they were doing. They were controlling the narrative. By staging this arrest at my workplace, they were ensuring my professional reputation was destroyed, making absolutely certain that nobody would believe a word I said when I finally spoke up. My mother, Patricia, stepped forward, shaking her head with a look of profound disappointment. "We paid for your rehab when you were 19, Kendra," she lamented loudly, making sure her voice carried to the cubicles outside my door. "We gave you every opportunity to walk the righteous path. We prayed over you night and day. Why would you steal from the Lord? Why would you shame our family like this?" For years, I would have swallowed the humiliation. I would have lowered my head, kept the peace, and let them paint me as the black sheep, the scapegoat they needed to maintain their flawless image in the community. But I was no longer the frightened teenager who needed their validation. I squared my shoulders and looked directly into my mother's eyes. I did not shout. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the icy precision of a woman who dealt entirely in facts. "Rehab, mother?" I asked, my voice cutting through the open plan office like a scalpel. "You mean the luxury wellness retreat in Sedona you paid for when Jasmine failed out of Spelman College? The same retreat you sent her to when she could not handle the academic pressure and suffered a nervous breakdown?" Jasmine's fake sobs hitched in her throat. Her eyes darted nervously toward the detectives. "You just used my name on the medical insurance forms." I continued, taking a step toward them, the handcuffs clinking loudly in the quiet room. "You put my name on those documents to protect Jasmine's pristine debutante image and to keep her precious sorority prospects intact. You committed insurance fraud so the church gossips would not find out your golden child was falling apart. So please do not stand in my office and talk to me about walking a righteous path." The color drained from Patricia's face. Deacon Calvin stiffened his authoritative persona, cracking under the weight of the sudden exposure. "Kendra, that is enough," he hissed, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Do not make this worse for yourself. You have disgraced this family, and now you are lashing out with lies to cover your tracks." "I deal in numbers, Dad," I replied smoothly, staring him down. "And numbers never lie." The lead detective, looking slightly uncomfortable with the intense family drama unfolding in the middle of a corporate office, cleared his throat and firmly gripped my arm. "Kendra, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. We need to go down to the precinct right now." "I understand," I told him, completely cooperative. As they turned me toward the door, my mother let out another dramatic wail, burying her face in her hands, while Jasmine patted her back, playing the role of the dutiful, supportive daughter to absolute perfection. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully buried their financial sins by burying me. They believed that because they held the power in our community, my truth would never see the light of day. They walked me past my stunned colleagues, past the reception desk, and toward the glass elevators. I did not cry. I did not bow my head in shame to hide from the stares. I walked with my spine straight and my head held high. As the elevator doors chimed open, I stopped and turned to the lead detective. "My briefcase," I said calmly, nodding back toward my mahogany desk where my leather bag sat untouched. "Take it with us." The detective frowned, looking from me to the briefcase. "We will process your personal items at the station, ma'am. We just need to get you in the car." "You are going to want that briefcase, detective," I insisted, my voice dropping to a low, serious tone that made him pause. "The blue leather folder inside is the very reason I am letting you put these cuffs on me today." He studied my face for a long second, searching for a trace of bluff or panic. He found neither. He signaled to his partner, who quickly walked over to my desk, grabbed the briefcase, and joined us in the elevator. The metal doors slid shut, cutting off the sight of my family's triumphant faces. They had no idea that the trap they had so carefully laid for me was actually the very cage that was about to lock them away forever. The heavy glass doors of my office building slid shut behind us, sealing away the murmurs of my shocked colleagues. The mid-morning Atlanta heat hit my face the moment we stepped onto the pavement. The lead detective gently but firmly guided my head down as he maneuvered me into the back of the squad car. The stiff vinyl seat was freezing against my legs. Through the plexiglass divider, I watched his partner settle into the passenger seat, resting my leather briefcase on his lap, as if it were a bomb waiting to detonate. In a way, it absolutely was. As the engine roared to life and we pulled out of the parking garage, the silence in the car was suffocating. The detectives did not ask me any questions. They probably thought they had this case completely figured out. An angry, jealous younger sister embezzling church funds out of spite. It was a neat, tidy narrative, perfectly packaged and gift-wrapped by my tearful mother and my saintly older sister. Then my phone vibrated in the pocket of my blazer. It buzzed once, then twice, then a third time in rapid succession. My hands were cuffed securely behind my back, the metal biting into my skin with every bump in the road. I shifted my weight and looked up at the rearview mirror, catching the lead detective's eye. "Detective," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of panic, "my phone is going off in my right pocket. Since you have completely stripped me of my ability to answer it, I would appreciate it if you could pull it out and hold it up to the plexiglass. I am expecting a very specific message." He frowned, gripping the steering wheel. He exchanged a brief look with his partner, who gave a subtle nod. The car stopped at a red light. The lead detective reached back through the sliding partition, his hand dipping into my blazer pocket. He pulled out my phone. The screen was lit up brightly with 3 new text messages. "Read them out loud," I instructed him, leaning forward slightly. "For the dashcam audio. I want this on the official record." The detective hesitated, looking at the locked screen. He squinted at the notifications. The sender's name was Trent. He cleared his throat and began to read. "Message 1. Karma finally caught up to the family outcast. Message 2. Try not to embarrass us too much on the evening news tonight. Message 3. Jasmine is devastated, but I told her this is exactly what happens when trash tries to play with the big dogs. Have fun in county. A harsh, sharp laugh escaped my throat, echoing in the confined space of the squad car. The detectives exchanged another glance, clearly thinking I was losing my mind. But I was not losing my mind. For the first time in 20 years, my mind was perfectly crystal clear. That is my brother-in-law, Trent, I told the detectives, leaning back against the uncomfortable seat. He is a white blonde, supposedly highly successful real estate developer who wears boat shoes on Tuesdays and speaks to me like I am the hired help at every Thanksgiving dinner. The detective in the passenger seat turned around slightly, resting his hand on my briefcase. He seemed genuinely curious now. My parents treat Trent like a deity. I continued keeping my tone conversational as if we were discussing the weather. Deacon Calvin and Patricia are obsessed with respectability politics. They have spent their entire lives trying to scrub away any trace of our working-class roots. To them, having a white son-in-law with a country club membership and a trust fund was their golden ticket to Atlanta's high society. They think his skin color and his golf buddies magically elevate our family's standing in the community. I looked out the window, watching the city blocks blur past. I thought about all the family dinners where Trent would make passive-aggressive comments about my natural hair, calling it unprofessional for a corporate accountant. I thought about the microaggressions he served with dessert, making snide remarks about affirmative action whenever my promotions were mentioned. And I thought about how my mother would immediately kick me under the table, shooting me a warning glare to keep my mouth shut. My parents enabled his casual racism for years, I said, bringing my attention back to the rearview mirror. They allowed him to disrespect me in my own childhood home because they were absolutely desperate for their proximity to his whiteness and his wealth. They sacrificed my self-esteem on the altar of his ego. They let him sit at the head of the table because he promised them access to a world they could not buy their way into. The lead detective signaled a turn, the blinker ticking rhythmically in the quiet car. But here is the beautiful tragedy of it all, I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. Trent's entire empire is a mirage. He is not a highly successful developer. He is a failure wearing an expensive suit. My parents think his heritage and his zip code protect them from financial ruin. Wait until they see his actual bank accounts. I do not just count beans for a living, gentleman. I am a forensic accountant. I follow the money. And Trent's money stopped existing a very long time ago. The detective in the passenger seat looked down at my leather briefcase. His hand tightened around the handle. He was beginning to realize that the tearful church family they had just left behind in my office lobby might not be the victims they claimed to be. We pulled into the precinct parking lot. The squad car eased into a reserved space near the back entrance. The lead detective turned off the engine, but he did not immediately get out of the car. He turned around in his seat, looking at me through the plexiglass barrier. "You are awfully calm for a woman looking at 20 years for grand larceny," he noted, his voice dropping its formal edge. "I am calm because I do not steal, detective," I replied. "I audit people who steal. And my sister has been stealing my peace, my reputation, and my sanity since we were kids. Today she just got greedy enough to leave a paper trail." They escorted me out of the vehicle and through the heavy security doors of the precinct. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed aggressively overhead, casting pale shadows on the scuffed linoleum floors. Officers moved around us in a chaotic dance of paperwork and ringing phones. The smells of stale coffee and industrial cleaner hit my nose. The lead detective guided me into a small, windowless interrogation room. The walls were painted a depressing shade of gray. In the center of the room sat a heavy metal table bolted to the floor, surrounded by 3 uncomfortable metal chairs. He removed my handcuffs. The sudden release of pressure sent a rush of blood back into my fingertips. I rubbed my wrists, maintaining my composure. The second detective walked in carrying my leather briefcase. He placed it carefully on the metal table, treating it with a new level of respect. "Sit tight," the lead detective instructed, pointing to the chair on my side of the table. "Do not touch anything. We are going to go process your initial paperwork and grab the evidence files the church provided. Your sister gave us copies of the forged checks. It is pretty damning stuff. We will be back in 10 minutes to take your official statement." He turned to leave the room. I reached out and placed my hand firmly on top of my leather briefcase. The sharp sound of the brass clasps snapping open echoed in the small room. I did not wait for his permission. I pulled out the thick blue leather folder. Its edges were worn, carrying the weight of 20 years of survival, 20 years of receipts, and 20 years of keeping my mouth shut while I gathered my ammunition. I slid the blue folder across the cold metal table. It stopped exactly an inch from the detective's hand. "Do not process anything yet," I told him, looking dead into his eyes. "Open tab 4. The second detective, a stocky man with a perpetual scowl, scoffed at my command. Instead of looking at my blue leather folder, he slammed a thick manila envelope onto the center of the scratched metal table. A stack of photocopied checks spilled out, fanning across the surface like a winning poker hand he thought he was about to play. Every single check bore the official watermark of the Greater Hope Ministry Building Fund. Every single check was made out to cash. And on the endorsement line of every single check was my signature. "Your sister was inconsolable when she handed these over," the lead detective said, leaning over the table, pressing his knuckles against the cold metal. "She found these buried in the church ledger during a routine internal review. She said you must have accessed the accounts when you helped her set up the new accounting software for the church last spring. We have $95,000 missing, Kendra. We have your signature on the withdrawals, and we have 3 upstanding community members, including a deacon, ready to testify that you have a history of troubled behavior. Do you want to explain yourself before we officially charge you?" I did not flinch. I slowly raised my hand and tapped my index finger against the photocopied signature on the top check. "The loop on the K is entirely too wide," I said, my voice eerily calm in the sterile, windowless room. "And the pressure on the downstroke of the A is far too heavy. I am a forensic accountant, gentlemen. I write with a fountain pen, and my downstrokes are light because I write rapidly. Jasmine presses hard because she writes with a heavy hand, especially when she is terrified of getting caught." The second detective crossed his arms. "Amateur handwriting analysis is not going to save you from a grand larceny charge." "I am not asking it to," I replied smoothly. "I am asking you to open tab 4 of the blue folder." The lead detective stared at me for a long, heavy moment. The absolute lack of fear in my eyes must have unsettled him. He reached across the table, grabbed the blue leather folder, flipped past the first 3 heavily tabbed sections, and opened tab 4. Inside was a meticulously organized stack of printed spreadsheets, highlighted bank statements, and certified data logs. "My family relies on the illusion of respectability," I explained, leaning back in my uncomfortable metal chair as the detectives began to scan the first page. "They believe that going to church every Sunday and hosting charity galas somehow makes them immune to consequences. But I have lived with these people my entire life. I realized very early on that my mother and father would always sacrifice me to protect Jasmine. So I adapted. I stopped treating them like family and started treating them like a hostile corporate entity. I have been auditing my own family since I was 12 years old." I reached out and pointed to the second document in the stack. "When I was 18, Jasmine maxed out a student credit card she opened in my name. She used it to buy designer clothes for her sorority rush week. My parents begged me not to report it. They said family takes care of family, and they promised to pay it off. They never did. When I was 22, she forged my signature as a co-signer on an auto loan that eventually tanked my credit score. Every time she stole, my parents covered it up, calling it a simple misunderstanding. But I kept every police report I was forced to drop. I kept every financial record. It is all in tabs 1 through 3. A 20-year documented habit of extreme financial abuse and identity theft perpetrated by my sister." The lead detective was quiet now. The aggressive posture he had brought into the room was slowly melting into a rigid, uncomfortable stillness. He was a cop who relied on reading people, and he was quickly realizing that the weeping, prayerful family in my office lobby had played him for an absolute fool. But let us talk about the $95,000, I said, tapping the spreadsheet currently in his hands. Jasmine is a thief, but she is a remarkably sloppy one. She forged those checks to create a paper trail pointing to me, but she did not actually walk into a bank and cash them. She used the church's online portal to authorize wire transfers, clearing the forged checks digitally. She thought because she used my login credentials, which she stole, that the digital footprint would lead right to my doorstep. I slid the paper closer to him, tapping a column of highlighted numbers. I pulled the administrative logs for the church's banking portal. I told them, watching their eyes widen as they realized the depth of my preparation. Every time a user logs in and initiates a wire transfer, the bank records the IP address of the device making the request. If you look at the forensic trace I compiled, you will see exactly where those funds were routed from. Those IP addresses do not trace back to my downtown apartment. They do not trace back to my office. The second detective leaned over his partner's shoulder, reading the technical report. He swallowed hard. Where do they trace back to? They trace directly to a specific MAC address assigned to a high-end commercial router. I stated, the satisfaction finally bleeding into my voice. A router located inside an exclusive gated suburban community in Alpharetta. Specifically, they trace directly to the custom-built smart home owned by my sister Jasmine and my highly successful brother-in-law Trent. The silence in the interrogation room was deafening. The only sound was the harsh hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. The detectives looked at the forensic IP trace, then at the forged checks, and then back at me. They had just dragged a completely innocent woman out of a corporate accounting firm in handcuffs, parading her in front of her colleagues based entirely on the fabricated testimony of the actual perpetrators. She initiated the transfers from her own living room, the lead detective murmured, rubbing his forehead, as the realization of his colossal mistake set in. She transferred the church funds directly into a shadow account while sitting on her own couch, and then she marched into your office and handed you over to us. Exactly, I said, offering a tight, humorless smile. She stole the money to fund her online gambling addiction and her designer wardrobe, and when the church announced an upcoming external audit, she panicked. She needed a scapegoat. I have been her designated scapegoat for 35 years. Why would today be any different? The second detective ran a hand over his face, shaking his head. If what you are saying is true, and this IP trace holds up with our cyber division, your sister is looking at serious federal wire fraud charges. But what about your parents? They brought us the checks. They corroborated her story. My parents are not victims, I corrected him sharply. They are co-conspirators. Turn to tab 5. The lead detective flipped the heavy page. He stared down at the documents waiting for him in the final section. These were not local banking records. These were complex financial instruments dense with legal jargon and offshore routing numbers. The church audit was scheduled for next month, I explained, leaning forward, my hands resting flat on the metal table. Jasmine realized that even if she framed me, the church would still be missing $95,000. My father is a deacon. His entire social identity is tied to that church. If the congregation found out his daughter stole from the building fund, he would be ruined. They could not let the audit happen while the accounts were empty. They needed to replace the money quietly before the auditors arrived and then use my arrest as a distraction. The detective traced his finger along a line of bold text on the document. His face dropped completely. The color drained from his cheeks as he read the offshore routing numbers and the heavily redacted signature lines I had managed to uncover. These routing numbers, the detective said, his voice barely above a whisper, as he looked up at me, pure shock radiating from his eyes. Your parents did not just ignore the theft. They co-signed a predatory bridge loan to cover the church's missing balance before the audit could take place. They took out high-interest unsecured debt just to hide what she did. I smiled coldly, watching the last of their arrogant assumptions shatter into pieces on the interrogation room table. I know, I said. Now let's talk about my brother-in-law's fake real estate empire. It took exactly 2 hours and 14 minutes for the lead detective to verify the offshore routing numbers and the IP addresses with their cyber division. The moment the digital footprint placed the $95,000 theft squarely inside Jasmine and Trent's custom-built smart home, the atmosphere in the precinct completely shifted. The handcuffs came off. The hostile questioning stopped. I walked out of those heavy glass doors, a free woman holding a freshly printed preliminary incident report. Jasmine was now officially listed as the primary suspect for felony wire fraud. My parents were designated as persons of interest for financial conspiracy. I ordered an Uber Black. If I was going to crash a pity party, I was going to arrive in comfort. I even had the driver stop at a local cafe so I could pick up a large iced vanilla latte. I needed the caffeine, and I wanted to be perfectly refreshed for the performance I was about to interrupt. The ride to my parents' house took 40 minutes, giving me plenty of time to admire the sprawling manicured lawns and massive wrought iron gates of their exclusive suburban neighborhood. My father, Deacon Calvin, and my mother, Patricia, had spent their entire lives cultivating this exact image. Their house was a towering brick McMansion with towering white pillars designed to project absolute moral and financial superiority to anyone who drove past. When the Uber pulled up to the curb, I noticed 4 expensive luxury sedans parked in the circular driveway. I recognized the license plates immediately. They belonged to the senior leadership of the Greater Hope Ministry. My parents wasted absolutely no time. The moment I was hauled away in a squad car, they had summoned the church elders to their home to control the narrative and cement their victim status. I walked up the sweeping concrete steps to the front entrance. The heavy oak double doors were slightly ajar. My mother loved leaving the front doors cracked when hosting important guests, treating her home like a public museum of her own success, so the neighbors could hear the joyful, righteous fellowship inside. I slipped silently through the gap and stepped into the grand marble foyer. I stood quietly in the hallway, letting the voices from the formal sunken living room wash over me. The smell of expensive floral perfume and freshly brewed artisanal tea filled the air. Patricia was currently holding court, and she was laying her performance on incredibly thick. Her voice trembled with a practiced melodic sorrow that she reserved specifically for church functions. We poured absolutely everything into Kendra, my mother sobbed loudly, ensuring her distress echoed beautifully off the vaulted ceilings. I tried to raise her with respectability and grace, Pastor. I put her in the best etiquette classes. I dressed her in the finest clothes, but her aggressive nature always overpowered her potential. She was always so angry, so resentful of our blessings. She simply refused to assimilate into our circles no matter how hard we prayed for her. I took a slow, silent sip of my iced coffee. Aggressive nature. That was Patricia's favorite code word for my refusal to accept her constant disrespect. When I refused to let Trent make racist jokes at the dinner table, I was being aggressive. When I demanded they stop forging my name on credit card applications to fund Jasmine's lavish lifestyle, I was being aggressive. Then Jasmine's voice chimed in. It was dripping with fake honey and theatrical forgiveness. I forgive her, Pastor. Jasmine sniffled, her voice a perfect imitation of a wounded saint. Even as the detectives took her away from her office today, I prayed for her soul. We are setting up a legal defense fund right now. Any donations from the church leadership would go directly to securing a defense attorney for her. We just want to help our poor, troubled Kendra find her way back to the light. The retainer fees are incredibly high, but family takes care of family. I lowered my coffee cup. The sheer audacity of the scam unfolding 20 feet away from me was almost breathtaking. They had successfully framed me for a felony, and now they were using my arrest to solicit cash donations from the church elders. They were going to take that sympathy money and use it to pay off the predatory bridge loan they had secretly taken out to cover Jasmine's tracks. They were stealing from the church twice in 1 month and using my name to do it. Deacon Calvin spoke next, his deep baritone voice rumbling with manufactured shame. It breaks my heart to ask the ministry for financial assistance during this dark hour, but the devil has taken hold of my youngest daughter. We must stand together as a community to right her terrible wrongs. I decided I had heard enough. I shifted my iced coffee to my left hand. I lifted my right foot, placed it flat against the heavy oak front door, and kicked it shut with every ounce of strength I had. The massive slab of wood slammed into the doorframe with a violent explosive thud that rattled the crystal chandelier hanging above my head. The sound cracked like a gunshot through the quiet suburban house. The weeping in the living room stopped instantly. The performative prayers were cut off mid-sentence. A dead, terrified silence fell over the entire house. I took another slow sip of my coffee, the ice clinking loudly against the plastic cup. I smoothed out the lapels of my tailored blazer, adjusted my designer watch, and stepped out of the hallway shadows. I walked slowly into the arched entryway of the formal living room. There were 6 church elders sitting on the plush white leather sofas, their teacups frozen halfway to their mouths. Patricia was sitting in a velvet armchair clutching a lace handkerchief to her chest, her mouth hanging open. Jasmine was standing near the coffee table holding a silver collection tray that already had several large checks resting on it. Deacon Calvin was standing by the marble fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, completely paralyzed. The head pastor sitting in the center of the room slowly turned his head toward the archway. His jaw dropped. His eyes widened in absolute shock as he took in my perfectly tailored suit, my completely calm demeanor, and the absolute absence of handcuffs on my wrists. "Praise the Lord," I said, my voice ringing out clear and cold across the silent room. I stepped fully onto the white carpet and flashed a brilliant, terrifying smile. The troubled sister has arrived. The collective gasp that sucked the air out of my parents' formal living room was pure music. One of the church elders dropped her porcelain teacup onto the saucer with a sharp clatter. The head pastor gripped the arms of his velvet chair, looking from my unblemished wrists to the silver collection tray, overflowing with checks meant for my supposed legal defense. My mother, Patricia, let out a strangled noise, her hand flying to her throat, as if I had just risen from the dead. Jasmine stood frozen by the glass coffee table, her crocodile tears drying up instantly. The entire performance had been derailed by my physical presence. I took another slow sip of my iced coffee, letting the silence stretch until it became absolutely suffocating. My father recovered first. Deacon Calvin was not a man who tolerated losing control of his carefully curated audience. His face flushed a deep mottled red, the veins in his neck bulging against his starched white collar. He abandoned his post by the marble fireplace and marched across the pristine white carpet, his heavy dress shoes sinking into the plush fibers. He reached me before I could take another step into the room, and his large hand clamped down hard on my upper arm. His grip was punishing a physical threat disguised as parental discipline. "You have disgraced this family for the last time," he hissed, his voice trembling with barely contained fury. He tried to pull me back toward the foyer, shielding me from the view of the church elders. "Get out of this house immediately. We are in the middle of a spiritual gathering trying to clean up your mess." I did not struggle. I simply looked down at his hand gripping my tailored blazer, then looked back up into his furious eyes. With a sharp, sudden jerk, I yanked my arm completely out of his grasp. I stepped past him, planting myself firmly in the center of the living room, directly in front of the head pastor. "Clean it up," I asked, my voice ringing out clear and steady. "Are you cleaning it up the same way you cleaned up the $40,000 Jasmine stole from my college fund when I was 19? Patricia gasped again, jumping up from her armchair. "Kendra, stop this lying right now in front of the pastor. Do not bring your sister into your sickness." "I am not lying, Mother, and you know it," I snapped back, refusing to let her interrupt me. "You told me the bank made a terrible error. You told me the funds were tied up in a market crash. But I was the one who had to take out predatory high-interest student loans just to finish my accounting degree. I worked 3 jobs between classes. I barely slept. I starved myself to afford textbooks while you took that $40,000 and bought Jasmine a brand new Mercedes-Benz." Jasmine opened her mouth to protest, but I raised my hand, silencing her. "You bought her that luxury car because she wrecked her previous one driving drunk after a sorority party, and you could not bear the thought of the neighbors seeing your golden child taking the city bus." I continued, making sure every single church elder heard every word. "You sacrificed my future to protect her image. I spent 5 years paying off the interest alone on those loans. I ate instant noodles in a studio apartment with no heating while you two flew to Paris for Jasmine's 25th birthday. You told the church I was just too independent, too stubborn to accept family help. The truth was, you had already drained my accounts to fund her delusions of grandeur. You covered her tracks then, and you are covering them now. Only this time she did not steal from me. She stole $95,000 from your congregation. The head pastor slowly stood up. He was a tall, imposing man who had led the Greater Hope ministry for 2 decades. He looked at the silver collection tray sitting on the coffee table, then looked at my father. The pieces were rapidly falling into place in his mind. The frantic prayer circle, the immediate demand for untraceable cash donations, my miraculous appearance without a single criminal charge attached to my name. Deacon Calvin the pastor said, his voice heavy with suspicion. What exactly is going on here? If Kendra is not in police custody, why are we passing a collection plate for her bail and legal fees? My father stammered, smoothing his silk tie nervously. Pastor, please. The girl is clearly having a mental breakdown. The shock of the arrest has caused her to lash out with these terrible accusations. We just need to get her some medical help. The only medical help needed here is a prescription for your chronic lying, I shot back. I was released because I handed the detectives the digital footprint of the wire transfers. The police already know the truth. Jasmine is the primary suspect. The detectives are probably securing a warrant for her arrest right now. Jasmine let out a high-pitched shriek. She backed away from the coffee table, shaking her head wildly. She is lying. She set me up. Trent, do something. Tell them she is lying. From the shadows of the hallway leading to the back patio, Trent finally made his entrance. He had been lurking out of sight, letting my parents do the heavy lifting with the church crowd. But now that his wife was backed into a corner, he stepped out. He puffed his chest out, trying to project the aura of a wealthy, untouchable white savior coming to rescue his distressed family. He adjusted his expensive designer belt and marched into the living room. He thought his country club membership and his passive-aggressive racism made him the smartest man in the room. He always treated me like an annoying pest that his wealthy in-laws regrettably had to tolerate. He stopped right in front of me, invading my personal space. He glared down at me, using his height to try and intimidate me into submission. You need to shut your mouth and leave my family's property right now, Kendra. Trent demanded, his voice dripping with absolute superiority and contempt. You are trespassing. If you do not walk out that front door in the next 10 seconds, I am calling the cops myself and having you dragged out of here like the trash you are. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. Trent was 6'2" and built like a man who spent more time at the country club bar than he did working his face, currently flushed with the absolute certainty that his mere presence was enough to command my obedience. For years he had operated under the delusion that his skin color, his expensive boat shoes, and his trust fund accent gave him an automatic pass to speak down to me. He was accustomed to my parents bowing to his every whim. They treated his absolute mediocrity like sheer brilliance simply because he represented the proximity to white wealth and high society they so desperately craved. He loved playing the patriarch. At every Thanksgiving dinner, he would stand at the head of the table, puffing out his chest, bragging about how he was the ultimate provider. He constantly reminded everyone that he was the protector, the highly successful real estate developer who elevated the Wilson family's standing just by marrying into it. He treated me like a hired servant, and my parents enabled every single second of it. Call the police, Trent! I challenged him, keeping my voice dead even and terrifyingly calm. Please do. I would absolutely love for the authorities to arrive while the church elders are still sitting right here on my mother's white leather sofas. It will save the financial fraud department a trip across town. Trent hesitated, his chest deflated a fraction of an inch. The aggressive bluster faltered as he realized I was not the cowed, silent sister-in-law he was used to bullying into submission. The reality of my confidence struck him like a physical blow. I bypassed him completely. I walked past his rigid shoulder, moving seamlessly from the sunken living room into the massive, open-concept kitchen. The pristine white marble island stretched out in the center of the room, gleaming under the recessed lighting. I set my iced coffee down on the counter. The condensation pooled against the expensive stone. I unclasped the brass locks of my blue leather folder. The sharp metallic click echoed through the heavy silence of the open floor plan. I reached into tab 5. Your family's property, Trent? I asked, my voice carrying effortlessly across the room as I pulled out a single heavily notarized sheet of paper. I slapped it face down onto the marble island. That is incredibly funny. I leaned forward over the counter, looking directly at Jasmine. She had followed me into the kitchen like a terrified shadow, her hands wringing the fabric of her designer dress. Jasmine, did your highly successful protective husband happen to tell you who actually holds the deed to your house? I asked, keeping my gaze locked on her widening eyes. Did he ever mention who truly owns the property where you initiated those $95,000 in fraudulent wire transfers this morning? Jasmine blinked rapidly. Her manufactured tears dried up instantly, replaced by a very real, very raw confusion. She looked down at the piece of paper trapped under my hand, then looked back at her husband. Trent was no longer flushed with angry arrogance. He had turned a sickly, ghostly shade of pale. His hands dropped uselessly to his sides. His mouth opened and closed silently, but he could not find a single word of defense to offer. The arrogant patriarch had vanished, leaving behind a terrified fraud. "What on earth are you talking about?" my mother demanded, rushing into the kitchen. The church elders filed in slowly behind her, hovering near the archway, unable to tear their eyes away from the spectacular implosion of the Wilson family. Trent bought that house in the gated community as a wedding gift for Jasmine. Patricia insisted, her voice shrill with panic. He is a premier real estate developer in Atlanta. He owns the entire subdivision. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh that cut through the tension in the room. He is a premier failure, Mother. Trent has not built a single property in half a decade. I flipped the paper over and slid it across the smooth marble island toward the head pastor, who had stepped forward to stand beside my mother. Who wants to tell the pastor that Trent's luxury development firm went bankrupt 2 years ago? I announced to the room, my words falling like an anvil. Jasmine gasped, grabbing the edge of the marble counter to steady herself. Her knuckles turned stark white. "Trent, tell her to shut up," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "Tell them she is lying." Trent remained frozen, his eyes glued to the hardwood floor, absolutely refusing to meet his wife's frantic gaze. "He cannot tell you I am lying because the proof is sitting right in front of you," I said, tapping the certified bankruptcy documents I pulled from the folder and arranged neatly on the island. "When the bank moved to foreclose on your custom-built smart home 2 years ago, Trent panicked. He knew if my parents found out he was entirely broke, he would lose the VIP treatment he receives at this house. He would lose his status, so he forged your signature, Jasmine. He took out a massive predatory secondary mortgage to cover his mounting arrears." I turned my attention back to the pastor, ensuring he understood exactly who was standing in his presence. "When that secondary mortgage money dried up, Trent started looking for other revenue streams." I continued, methodically laying out the financial timeline. "Trent is the one who convinced Jasmine to embezzle from the Greater Hope Ministry Building Fund. Jasmine may have stolen my login credentials and initiated the transfers from her laptop, but Trent supplied the offshore shadow accounts to hide the money. They used your church donations to pay their mortgage and keep up the illusion of their wealthy suburban lifestyle." The head pastor looked down at the deed, then at the bankruptcy filings, and finally at the highlighted bank records detailing the offshore routing numbers. He adjusted his glasses, reading the undeniable legal print. He slowly turned his head to look at Deacon Calvin. My father was leaning heavily against the stainless steel refrigerator, clutching his chest, as his entire social identity collapsed around him. The respectability politics he valued above his own daughter's well-being had just been entirely dismantled. And when the church announced the upcoming external audit, I concluded my parents took out a high-interest loan to quietly cover the theft. They planned to let me take the fall so Trent's precious reputation would remain untarnished and the deacon could keep his seat at the head of the church. I picked up my iced coffee, taking a long, satisfying sip. "So?" I asked the silent, horrified room, a cold satisfaction settling deep in my bones. "Who wants to lead the next prayer circle?" "You are a liar!" Jasmine shrieked, her voice cracking and echoing violently against the vaulted ceiling of the living room. Her perfectly manicured hands balled into fists at her sides. She lunged forward, her fingers clawing frantically at Trent's tailored sleeve. "Trent, do something. Put her in her place right now. Tell them she is making this all up. Tell them she is crazy." Trent did not move a single muscle. The golden son-in-law, the man my parents practically worshipped as the pinnacle of achievement, stood frozen on the imported Persian rug. The arrogant bluster he had marched in with just moments prior had completely evaporated. He stared blankly at the marble floor, his jaw tight, a thick bead of sweat rolling down the side of his face. He knew the game was over. The illusion of his generational wealth, his unshakable competence, and his prestigious status was disintegrating in front of the most influential people in their social circle. "He cannot put me anywhere, Jasmine," I said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the center of the room. "He is entirely powerless. He has spent the last 5 years standing at the head of our Thanksgiving table, lecturing me on financial responsibility and corporate ambition. He leveraged his whiteness and his country club membership as a shield of assumed wealth, acting like he was doing us a favor by gracing this family with his presence. Meanwhile, he was secretly draining your joint bank accounts to pay for his golf fees while his businesses collapsed into ruin. He is a parasite wearing a $5,000 suit." "Your family's property, Trent?" I asked, turning my gaze directly to him. I let out a sharp, genuinely amused laugh. "That is incredibly funny. Jasmine, did your highly successful, protective husband happen to tell you who actually holds the deed to your house?" Jasmine blinked rapidly, the manufactured panic giving way to a very real, very raw confusion. She looked at me, then back to her husband, waiting for him to unleash the righteous fury he usually reserved for service workers and valets. But Trent remained absolutely silent, his face turning a sickly, ghostly shade of pale. "But Trent's bankruptcy is just the opening act of this tragedy." I continued, turning my attention away from the pathetic shell of my brother-in-law and locking eyes with my father. Deacon Calvin had sunk heavily onto the arm of the white leather sofa, his head buried in his hands. My mother, Patricia, was hyperventilating, her hand clutching the pearls at her throat. "Let us talk about how you managed to keep Trent and Jasmine from getting evicted when the banks came knocking 2 years ago." I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out my iPad. My parents had spared absolutely no expense when outfitting this house, including syncing the massive 80-inch smart television above the marble fireplace to the local network. I tapped my screen 3 times. The television immediately switched from a looping slideshow of perfect family portraits to a high-definition cast of my iPad display. A collective gasp rippled through the church elders as public documents flashed onto the massive screen. Because Trent's credit was completely decimated, and Jasmine's income from her part-time boutique job could not even cover the property taxes, they were weeks away from foreclosure, I announced. Pacing slowly in front of the illuminated screen, like an executive delivering a keynote presentation. "You two stepped in to save them, but your own credit was already severely overextended from financing the illusion of this lavish suburban lifestyle. You did not have the liquid cash to bail them out. So you went to a private high-interest lender. You took out a massive second mortgage on this exact house to pay off Trent's debts and save Jasmine the embarrassment of losing her luxury home." I tapped the screen, zooming in on the county clerk's public database record displayed on the television. "But even a secondary mortgage requires proof of income," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "The lender looked at your debt-to-income ratio and laughed. They demanded a guarantor. They needed someone with a flawless credit history, 0 debt, and a high corporate income. They needed me. But you knew I would never agree to subsidize Trent's failures, so you simply did it for me." I swiped to the next document, an official loan agreement featuring 3 signatures at the bottom. 2 belonged to my parents. The third was a clumsy, heavily pressed forgery of my name. "You thought I would not notice a hard credit inquiry filed by a shadow lending firm, Dad?" I asked, my voice ringing out clearly in the silent room. "I am a forensic accountant. It is literally my job to find hidden money. I have active monitoring alerts set up for every possible variation of my social security number because I knew exactly what you people were capable of. When I saw the alert pop up, I did not just file a police report. I conducted an investigation. I swiped to the final document, a certified transfer of deed bearing the official seal of the state. I tracked down the private lender. I explained, watching my father's face contort in absolute horror. I liquidated my own secure high-yield stock portfolios. I wired the funds directly to their Miami office, and I bought the debt at a premium. I bought your loan, Dad. I am the sole lien holder on this property. If you default on a single payment, I am legally authorized to seize this estate. I am your landlord. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The church elders were staring at the 80-inch screen, their eyes wide as they read the legal transfer of ownership. The pillars of their congregation, the people who had just spent the last hour begging for defense funds for their troubled daughter, were exposed as desperate, manipulative frauds. Patricia suddenly snapped. The Southern belle persona she had perfected over decades completely shattered. She sprang up from her velvet armchair, her face flushed with a dark, furious red. "This is a private family matter," Patricia shrieked, waving her arms frantically at the elders sitting on her sofas. "I must ask you all to leave right now. Please. We need to deal with this internally. Get out. Get out of my house." The elders exchanged bewildered, deeply uncomfortable glances. Two of the women quickly stood up, grabbing their purses, eager to escape the radioactive fallout of the Wilson family. But the head pastor did not move an inch. He slowly stood up, smoothing the front of his suit jacket. He ignored Patricia's frantic demands entirely. He crossed his arms over his broad chest and planted his feet firmly into the carpet. His deep, commanding gaze bypassed my mother and locked directly onto my father, who was still trembling on the arm of the sofa. Deacon Calvin, the pastor, said, his voice echoing like thunder through the lavish living room. "I am a patient man, but I need you to answer me very carefully right now." My father looked up, his eyes glassy and terrified. "If Kendra bought the debt on this house last month," the pastor continued, gesturing toward the undeniable proof still glowing on the television screen. "If this secondary mortgage is already completely settled under her name, then where did the $95,000 missing from the church building fund actually go?" The silence in the kitchen was absolute, heavy enough to crush bone. The head pastor did not break his gaze from my father. The sheer force of his presence demanded an immediate answer. He was no longer the gentle shepherd of the Greater Hope Ministry. He was a man who realized his flock had been led to slaughter by the very wolves sitting on his deacon board. "Answer the question." Calvin the pastor commanded, his voice vibrating with a quiet, lethal authority. "Where did the $95,000 go?" Before my father could even open his mouth to formulate another pathetic lie, Jasmine broke. The pressure of the room, the undeniable proof of their financial ruin glowing on the television screen, and the realization that my parents could no longer protect her, finally shattered her pristine facade. She spun around, her manicured finger pointing directly at her husband's chest. "He made me do it," Jasmine screamed, her voice tearing through the kitchen. The tears flowing down her cheeks this time were entirely real, born of pure panic and self-preservation. She grabbed the edge of the marble island, sobbing wildly. "Trent manipulated me. He told me his development firm was going under. He said if I did not find the cash to float his operations, we would be out on the street. He begged me, Pastor. He emotionally abused me until I had no choice but to take those funds to save his business." The church elders gasped in unison, clutching their Bibles and designer handbags. Patricia rushed forward to wrap her arms around her weeping golden child, glaring at Trent as if he were the devil incarnate. "How could you force my daughter into such a terrible position?" Patricia wailed, immediately buying into Jasmine's desperate narrative. "You dragged her into your financial mess." But Trent was no longer playing the part of the stoic, humiliated husband. His own wife throwing him directly into the line of fire to save her own skin was the absolute final straw. His face turned a deep mottled purple. The veins in his neck strained against his collar as he stepped forward, slapping Patricia's hands away from Jasmine. "You lying, parasitic fraud!" Trent roared, his voice booming over Jasmine's theatrical sobbing. "Do not you dare try to pin this on me." Trent shoved his hand into the inner pocket of his tailored blazer and ripped out his smartphone. His fingers flew furiously across the screen, unlocking applications and pulling up digital records. He marched straight past my mother and shoved the phone directly into the pastor's face. "Look at it!" Trent demanded, his chest heaving with rage. "Look at where the church money actually went. She did not give a single dime to my business. I have not seen a penny of that $95,000. The pastor adjusted his glasses, peering closely at the glowing screen of Trent's phone. I watched from across the marble island, thoroughly enjoying the spectacular implosion of the perfect couple. "She is a degenerate gambling addict," Trent announced to the entire room, pacing furiously in front of the horrified church elders. "That is her VIP account log for an offshore casino. She lost every single cent of that $95,000 playing high-stakes online baccarat." Jasmine let out a strangled shriek and lunged for the phone, but Trent yanked it out of her reach, his eyes burning with absolute contempt. She blew the church building fund betting $10,000 a hand on her iPad. While sitting by our country club pool, Trent continued, making sure every syllable landed like a physical blow. And whatever she did not lose at the virtual baccarat tables, she spent funding her delusional luxury lifestyle. Look at her closet. Look at the designer bags she buys every week. She stole from the church to fund her shopping addiction and feed her gambling habit, and she used my bankruptcy as a convenient cover story. The head pastor's face hardened into a mask of pure disgust. He scrolled through the transaction logs on Trent's phone, viewing the undeniable proof of wire transfers, moving directly from the shadow accounts Jasmine had set up into the offshore casino's holding firm. The deposits matched the stolen church funds down to the exact dollar. "This is an abomination," the pastor whispered, handing the phone back to Trent. He looked at Jasmine, who had collapsed onto one of the kitchen bar stools, burying her face in her hands as her entire world burned to ash. "You stole the foundation of our new community center to fund a gambling addiction. You stole from the widows and the working-class families of our congregation." My mother let out a loud, dramatic wail, finally realizing that Jasmine's pristine reputation was completely destroyed. The golden child was not a victim of a bad husband. She was a criminal. The elders began whispering fiercely among themselves. Words like police fraud and prison echoed off the high ceilings. The reality of the situation was settling in. Jasmine was going to be arrested, and the scandal would drag the entire Wilson family through the mud, exposing them as accomplices to grand larceny. That realization finally snapped my father out of his paralyzed state of shock. Deacon Calvin could not survive a public scandal. His entire identity, his position on the church board, and his social standing in the community relied entirely on the illusion of absolute respectability. If the police were called, he would lose everything. He pushed himself off the sofa and sprinted across the living room, his heavy dress shoes slipping slightly on the polished marble floor. He shoved himself between the pastor and his weeping daughter, his eyes wild with sheer desperation. His hands were shaking violently as he reached into the breast pocket of his suit coat. "Pastor, wait," Calvin pleaded, his voice cracking with panic. He pulled out a leather-bound checkbook and a gold fountain pen, his hands trembling so badly he nearly dropped them onto the island. "We do not need to involve the authorities. We do not need to ruin this young woman's life over a terrible, terrible mistake." He slapped the checkbook down onto the marble counter, right next to the deed of the house I now owned. He clicked the pen open, looking frantically at the pastor and the assembled elders. "Pastor, we can handle this internally," Calvin begged, his voice high and entirely stripped of its usual commanding authority. "Patricia and I will cover it. I will write the church a check right now to replace the funds entirely, every single penny. Please, Pastor, let us handle this quietly as a family." The scratching sound of my father's gold fountain pen tearing across the surface of his leather-bound checkbook was the most absurd noise I had ever heard. He was pressing down so hard the paper was practically ripping. He was desperately trying to sign away a problem that had already engulfed his entire existence. The sheer, unadulterated delusion of the act hit me squarely in the chest. I started to laugh. It began as a low chuckle bubbling up from the very depths of my stomach before erupting into a full, genuine laugh that echoed loudly against the vaulted ceilings of the kitchen. Patricia glared at me, her face streaked with ruined mascara. She stepped in front of Calvin as if her slender frame could physically block the reality of what was happening. "This is not a laughing matter, Kendra," she hissed, her voice shaking with rage and terror. "Your father is fixing this. We are handling it. Now show some respect to the deacon of this church." I did not stop laughing. I set my iced coffee back down on the marble island and picked up my iPad. I swiped away the deed to their house and opened a new application. Years ago, my parents had forced me to handle all of their personal accounting and tax filings for free, demanding I use my corporate financial skills to maintain their wealth. They never bothered to change their passwords when they cast me out. With a single tap, I cast the new screen to the 80-inch television in the living room. The bright white background of their joint banking portal illuminated the space, displaying their financial truth in stark, unforgiving high definition. "Fixing it with what money, Dad?" I asked, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the room. Calvin froze. The gold fountain pen hovered an inch above the checkbook. He slowly turned his head toward the massive television screen. The church elders leaned in, their eyes widening at the numbers displayed in bold black text. "You are frantically writing a check for $95,000 to the head pastor of your church," I said, walking slowly around the marble island to stand directly beside him. "But the screen behind me shows your primary joint checking account currently holds exactly $10,412, and your savings account holds a grand total of 0. My father's mouth fell open. He looked from the screen to his checkbook, his hands trembling violently. Patricia let out a strangled gasp and darted toward the television, frantically waving her hands, as if she could physically wipe the numbers off the glass screen. "Calvin's retirement," she stammered, her voice pitched high with desperation. "We have investments. We have portfolios. We can liquidate the 401k tomorrow morning. Pastor, I promise you the money is guaranteed." I tapped my iPad screen one more time. The display shifted from the checking account to my father's primary retirement portfolio. The balance loaded instantly. 0. There is no retirement fund. "Mother," I said, my voice echoing with finality, "you do not have a 401k to liquidate. You do not have a safety net. You do not have anything left." Jasmine let out a sharp cry, her hands flying to her mouth. She looked at our father, her eyes wide with absolute horror. "Daddy, what is she talking about?" Jasmine cried. "Where is your money?" I turned my gaze to Trent. The golden son-in-law had backed himself into the corner of the kitchen, trying to physically merge with the custom cabinetry to avoid the fallout. "Why do not you ask the premier real estate developer standing in the corner?" I suggested, pointing directly at Trent. "He is the reason your parents are entirely broke, Jasmine. Last November, Trent owed a massive amount of money to some very dangerous, very unamused silent partners who funded his final failed commercial project. They were preparing to file federal fraud charges against him. He was weeks away from being indicted and sent to a federal penitentiary." The church elders gasped again. One of the older women actually crossed herself, taking a large step backward away from Patricia, as if the family's financial ruin was contagious. My father gutted his entire life savings. I continued, ensuring every single person in the room heard the absolute truth. He drained 40 years of hard-earned retirement money, paid the massive early withdrawal penalties, and handed every last cent over to Trent's investors to keep his precious son-in-law out of a prison jumpsuit. He destroyed his own future and yours just to maintain the illusion that his daughter married into high society. The only liquid cash he has left to his name is that $10,000. That check he is writing right now is going to bounce before the pastor even reaches the bank. The gold fountain pen slipped from my father's fingers. It hit the marble counter with a sharp clatter, rolling off the edge and dropping onto the hardwood floor. Deacon Calvin slumped forward, resting his forehead against the cold stone of the kitchen island. He looked like a man who had just been handed a death sentence. His entire identity was built on being the wealthiest, most respected man in the congregation. Now he was exposed as a penniless enabler who had sacrificed his own daughter to protect criminals. Jasmine collapsed onto the floor, her designer dress pooling around her. She buried her face in her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. There was no daddy to write a check. There was no husband to shield her. There was no money left to steal. The reality of a cold, concrete prison cell was suddenly staring her right in the face. The head pastor walked slowly toward the marble island. He looked down at the forged check sitting next to the deed of the house. He did not touch either document. He simply looked at my father, his expression hardening into a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. Calvin the pastor said, his voice stripped of any pastoral warmth. It was cold, resolute, and terrifyingly final. You stood at the altar of our church and preached about integrity. You sat in my office and demanded we pray for your youngest daughter, knowing full well she was being framed for a crime your eldest daughter committed. You lied to my face. You lied to this congregation. You allowed the widows and the working families of this community to be robbed blind to fund a gambling addiction, and then you tried to pay me off with a worthless piece of paper to save your own pride. My father slowly raised his head. Tears were streaming down his face, soaking into his starched white collar. "Pastor, please," he whispered, his voice broken and pathetic. "I was just trying to protect my family. I was trying to protect our name." "You have no name left in this community," the pastor replied, shaking his head. "Effective immediately, you are completely stripped of your title as deacon. You are hereby removed from the church board, and you are no longer welcome to serve in any capacity at the Greater Hope Ministry." Patricia let out a loud, agonizing wail, collapsing against the side of the refrigerator. The social standing she valued above oxygen had just been permanently revoked. And as for the missing funds, the pastor continued, turning his hard gaze toward Jasmine, who was still weeping on the floor. "The Greater Hope Ministry has a fiduciary duty to its congregation. We will not handle this internally. We will not sweep theft under the rug to protect your pride. I am leaving this house right now, and I am driving directly to the police station. We are pressing full criminal charges against Jasmine, and we will hand over all financial records showing her involvement. May God have mercy on your souls, because the justice system will not." The heavy oak front door shut with a resounding, definitive thud that vibrated through the floorboards. The pastor was gone. He took with him the last shred of respectability the Wilson family possessed. The silence he left behind was absolute, thick, and suffocating. It was the heavy, dead quiet that immediately precedes a catastrophic structural collapse. My father remained hunched over the marble kitchen island, his eyes vacant, staring blindly at the voided check that was supposed to buy his salvation. He looked a decade older, a hollowed-out shell of the arrogant deacon who had commanded this household just an hour ago. Patricia was hyperventilating by the refrigerator, her perfectly manicured hands gripping her hair, her lips moving in silent, frantic prayers to a God who was no longer listening. But it was Jasmine who finally broke the silence. The transition was terrifying to witness. The weeping, helpless victim act vanished the exact second she realized it was no longer working. The performative tears dried on her flushed cheeks. She slowly lifted her head from her knees. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled, clinging to her face in damp strands. She stared at the empty foyer where the pastor had just exited, processing the reality that she was actually going to be arrested. She was going to face a judge. She was going to prison. Then her gaze slowly tracked across the room and locked onto me. Pure, unadulterated venom contorted her features. Her eyes, usually wide and innocent, narrowed into dark, feral slits. She pushed herself up from the hardwood floor, her chest heaving violently beneath the expensive silk of her designer dress. The facade of the delicate, misunderstood golden child shattered into a million jagged pieces, revealing the vicious, entitled monster my parents had spent 30 years cultivating. "You planned this!" Jasmine screamed, the sound tearing from her throat like a physical weapon. "You set me up!" She did not hesitate. Stripped of her perfect image, stripped of her husband's protection, and completely cornered by her own crimes, she completely lost her mind. She lunged at me. She cleared the distance between the living room and the kitchen in 3 massive strides. Her hands raised, her French manicured fingers curled into sharp, desperate claws, aimed directly at my face. She was aiming to physically tear the truth right out of me. I did not panic. I did not flinch. I had spent my entire childhood anticipating Jasmine's violent, unchecked tantrums. I simply planted my back foot and stepped smoothly to the side. I let her blind, furious momentum carry her entirely past me. With a screech of rage and terror, Jasmine flew through the empty air where I had just been standing. She could not stop her own velocity. She pitched forward, arms flailing, and crashed headfirst into Patricia's prized antique mahogany credenza lining the dining room wall. The impact was spectacular. The heavy piece of furniture shuddered violently. Two massive imported porcelain vases that my mother had spent thousands of dollars acquiring tooted off the edge and hit the hardwood floor, exploding into hundreds of sharp, jagged shards. Jasmine crumpled into the wreckage, crying out as her shoulder slammed against the carved wood, sending a silver serving tray clattering down right on top of her. Patricia let out a blood-curdling scream. She abandoned her post by the refrigerator and sprinted across the room, her high heels crunching over the destroyed porcelain. "Look what you did!" Patricia shrieked, falling to her knees beside the wreckage to cradle Jasmine's head. "You pushed your sister. You psycho, you could have killed her. Look at this mess." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the two of them, tangled in the debris of their own making. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. Just like when we were kids, Jasmine, I said, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal authority that cut right through my mother's hysterical wailing. "You get violent, break things, and Mom calls it clumsiness. Only this time I'm not taking the blame." Jasmine groaned, clutching her shoulder. Her face twisted in pain and humiliation. Patricia was frantically trying to brush the shards of porcelain away from Jasmine's expensive dress, still muttering curses at me, still desperately clinging to the delusion that I was the villain of this story. I turned my head to look for Trent, the great patriarch, the fierce protector. Trent had used the chaotic distraction of Jasmine's physical attack to make his move. He was currently sidestepping along the far wall of the living room, moving as quietly as a rat avoiding a trap. He had already scooped his car keys off the console table. He did not look at his wife bleeding on the floor. He did not look at his mother-in-law weeping over the destroyed antiques. He did not look at the father-in-law whose life savings he had completely evaporated. He looked at the front door, his eyes wide with the desperate need to escape the fallout of his own financial crimes. He slipped through the heavy oak door without saying a single word, abandoning his wife to the authorities just to save his own skin. The sound of his luxury SUV starting in the driveway and speeding off down the street was the final nail in Jasmine's coffin. My father heard the car speed away. Deacon Calvin finally lifted his head from the marble island. He looked at the shattered vases. He looked at his weeping wife. He looked at his ruined criminal daughter. And then he looked at me. There was no anger left in his eyes, only a vast, terrifying emptiness. The realization that he had sacrificed his capable, loyal daughter for a family of parasites had finally crushed him. I ignored his pathetic stare. I walked slowly over to the dining room wall, my shoes stepping carefully over the glittering remains of Patricia's prized vases. I stopped right in front of Jasmine, who was currently staring at the front door, realizing that Trent had actually left her behind. I crouched down next to her on the floor. The scent of her expensive floral perfume mixed with the metallic tang of fear radiating off her skin. Patricia tried to swat me away, but I gave her a look so deeply chilling she instantly recoiled, pulling her hands back to her chest. I leaned in close, ensuring Jasmine could see her own terrified reflection in my eyes. "I didn't set you up, Jasmine," I whispered, keeping my tone conversational and utterly devoid of sympathy. "You dug your own grave. You stole that money. You lied to everyone. You chose to live a life you could not afford, and you expected me to bleed to cover the cost." Jasmine squeezed her eyes shut, shaking her head side to side in denial, hot tears cutting fresh tracks through her ruined makeup. "But just to be thorough," I said, leaning in just a fraction of an inch closer so she could hear every single syllable clearly, "I did call the IRS." Jasmine's eyes flew open. The breath hitched in her throat, a sickening rattle of pure panic. When I was doing the forensic accounting on your offshore casino deposits, I noticed a very interesting pattern. I continued my voice, steady and completely relentless. You and Trent have not claimed those gambling losses, nor have you declared the massive secondary mortgage income on your joint tax returns for the last 3 years. You committed federal tax evasion to hide the bankruptcy. The audit division is extremely interested in the digital trail I forwarded to their anonymous tip line this morning. Patricia gasped, dropping her hands from Jasmine's shoulders and backing away as if her golden child had suddenly caught fire. The local police are coming for the church money, Jasmine, I told her, standing up and smoothing out my tailored blazer. But the federal government is coming for absolutely everything else. I turned my back on the wreckage, walked over to the marble island, and picked up my blue leather folder. It was time to leave them to their ruins. But I did not walk toward the front door. I stopped halfway across the foyer, my fingers gripping the smooth, cool surface of the blue leather folder. The sound of Jasmine's pathetic whimpering among the shattered porcelain echoed through the sprawling house, mingling with the erratic, shallow breaths of my mother. I turned slowly on my heel, letting the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the room settle over us like a burial shroud. It was time to finish the job. I walked back toward the marble kitchen island. Patricia and Calvin completely froze. The sheer terror radiating from their bodies was palpable. They watched me with wide, unblinking eyes like prey pinned under the shadow of a predator. I placed the blue folder flat on the marble surface. The slap of the leather against the stone made my father physically flinch. I took a deep, steadying breath and flipped past the bank statements, past the forged secondary mortgage, and past Jasmine's offshore casino logs. I turned directly to the final tab in the folder. I pulled out a thick, meticulously stapled stack of documents. The paper was heavy, official, and undeniable. I spread the pages out across the island, ensuring the bold federal headers were facing directly toward my parents. "These are your joint tax returns," I announced, my voice dropping to a calm, clinical register that commanded total silence in the room. 5 years of federal and state filings prepared by your private accountant and signed by both of you under penalty of perjury. Calvin's face drained of the very last drop of its color. His eyes darted wildly across the documents, instantly recognizing the meticulous spreadsheets and the signature lines at the bottom of the pages. He took a stumbling step backward, his back hitting the stainless steel refrigerator. "You spent my entire adult life tearing me down," I said, shifting my gaze away from my broken father and staring directly into my mother's terrified eyes. "You made it your absolute mission to make me feel small, unwanted, and entirely inadequate." I picked up the top document and held it up. "You told me I was socially inept and too aggressive to ever succeed in your high-class circles," I said, taking a slow step toward Patricia. "You mocked my career. You told your country club friends I was a bitter, isolated workaholic who would never amount to anything because I refused to play the game your way. You threw me away because I did not fit your perfect manufactured image." Patricia swallowed hard, her throat clicking audibly in the quiet kitchen. She pressed her back against the wall, her hands gripping the edges of the counter as if she might collapse. "But my aggressive 6-figure salary was exactly what you were secretly claiming on your business taxes." I continued, throwing the document down onto the floor right at her feet. "You were forging my signature as a dependent to inflate your household income for those country club loans." The silence that followed was so absolute I could hear the faint hum of the central air conditioning unit. "You needed liquid capital to maintain this absurd lifestyle," I explained, pacing slowly in front of the island. "You needed to show the banks and the private lenders that you had an incredibly high household gross income to qualify for those platinum-tier credit lines and the massive loans you used to float Trent's failing business. But your own manufacturing company was bleeding money. Your personal investments were tanking. So you simply absorbed my corporate earnings into your household filings. You listed me as a phantom employee and a financial dependent. You actively committed federal tax fraud using the identity of the daughter you actively despised." Calvin let out a low, agonizing groan. He squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head side to side as if he could forcefully eject the reality of his crimes from his brain. "You actually thought I would never find out," I said, letting out a short, cold laugh. You thought because you isolated me from the family I would never look back. You thought I was too broken by your rejection to ever run a background check on my own social security number. But you forgot one very important detail, Mother. I am a forensic accountant. Finding buried money and exposing financial parasites is literally what I do for a living. And you handed me a 5-year paper trail of your own felonies. Patricia's eyes darted frantically around the room, searching for an escape, searching for someone to blame, searching for any possible way to twist the narrative back in her favor. But there was no one left. The pastor was gone. The church elders had fled. Trent had abandoned them. Jasmine was bleeding on the floor. I did not just call the IRS for Jasmine's offshore accounts. I stated clearly, letting the finality of the statement sink into their bones. I handed over a complete unredacted portfolio of your forged tax returns. The audit division has already opened an active investigation. They are going to freeze your corporate accounts. They are going to seize your remaining assets. They are going to strip this house bare to recover the fraudulent loans you secured using my name. The weight of the impending destruction finally settled over the room. The illusion of the wealthy, untouchable Wilson family was completely eradicated. They were not pillars of the community. They were desperate, pathetic thieves who had cannibalized their own children to maintain a facade. Suddenly, a high, piercing sound cut through the silence. It started as a faint wail in the distance, quickly rising in pitch and volume. The sound echoed down the quiet, affluent suburban street, bouncing off the manicured lawns and the sprawling mansions. Sirens. Multiple sirens approaching incredibly fast. The flashing reflection of red and blue lights began to dance across the sheer curtains of the living room windows. Patricia's head snapped toward the front door. For a brief, delusional second, the sheer panic in her eyes vanished instantly, replaced by a sudden, sickening wave of arrogance. Her posture straightened. The old, entitled matriarch clawed her way back to the surface, refusing to accept defeat. She looked at the flashing lights, and a slow, triumphant smirk spread across her face. She thought she had won. She truly believed the local police were coming for me. She assumed a neighbor had heard the crash of the antique credenza, or perhaps Calvin had silently hit a panic button to have me removed. She thought her social standing was about to save her one final time. She stepped away from the wall, smoothing the front of her expensive silk blouse, her chin lifting with that familiar dripping condescension. "You really thought you could come into my house and threaten us?" Patricia spat, her voice ringing with misplaced confidence as the sirens grew deafeningly loud outside the front door. "You are a bitter, jealous girl throwing a tantrum. The police are going to arrest you for trespassing and assault." She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face, her smirk widening into a look of absolute venomous victory. "You cannot prove any of this," Patricia declared. "It is your word against our standing in this community." Patricia stood tall, her chin raised, waiting for the familiar, respectful knock of Chief Weber, or perhaps one of the local precinct deputies she routinely invited to the country club charity galas. She patted her hair into place, her smirk practically cemented onto her face. She was already practicing the exact tone of amused condescension she would use to dismiss whatever complaint I had supposedly filed. But the strobing lights bleeding through the sheer, custom-imported curtains suddenly shifted. The harsh, frantic red and blue of local law enforcement were entirely absent. Instead, a blinding sequence of amber and bright white illuminated the living room, slicing through the dim evening light and casting long, erratic shadows against the vaulted ceiling. The sound of the engines idling outside was entirely wrong. It was not the high, strained whine of standard police cruisers. It was the heavy, deep rumbling growl of multiple high-capacity armored engines. The brutal crunch of gravel under massive reinforced tires echoed through the front windows as several vehicles aggressively hopped the pristine curb and swarmed the manicured front lawn. The heavy metallic slams of thick car doors shutting in unison sounded like rhythmic gunfire. I did not move a single muscle. I simply watched the blood drain from Patricia's face, as the reality of the situation began to violently dismantle her delusion. For decades, Patricia had wielded her social standing like an impenetrable titanium shield. She had spent her entire adult life burying every ugly family secret, every financial misstep, and every toxic behavior under a mountain of carefully curated social capital. She relied exclusively on her elite sorority sisters, her prestigious church connections, and her Wednesday afternoon bridge club to manipulate the local narrative. If a problem ever arose, Patricia simply made a phone call to the right person, hosted the right extravagant dinner party, or wrote a strategically placed check to make the inconvenience disappear. She genuinely believed her zip code, her designer wardrobe, and her carefully maintained image elevated her entirely above the law. But federal agents executing a coordinated raid for wire fraud and massive tax evasion do not care about her bridge club standing. They do not care how many charity galas she has hosted, they do not care about the size of her diamond rings, and they certainly do not care about the pristine, utterly fake reputation of the Wilson family name. Loud, synchronized thuds echoed from the front porch as heavy tactical boots hit the imported Italian tile. The sheer number of footfalls vibrating against the exterior of the house indicated a massive, overwhelming presence. Patricia's arrogant smirk finally dissolved, replaced by a twitching, unhinged confusion. Her perfectly manicured hands began to tremble. She glanced back at Calvin, who had not moved from his paralyzed slump against the stainless steel refrigerator. His face was buried in his hands, completely broken. "Calvin!" Patricia hissed, her voice trembling as she frantically smoothed the front of her silk blouse, again attempting to maintain order. Calvin, go to the door. It is probably just a misunderstanding with the alarm company. Tell them to turn those awful lights off right this instant. My father did not answer. He simply squeezed his eyes shut tighter, letting out a low, pathetic whimper, knowing exactly what was waiting on the other side of that solid mahogany wood. Jasmine groaned from the floor, pushing herself up from the shattered remains of the antique vases. She wiped a streak of blood from her shoulder and stared at the front windows, her eyes wide with mounting terror as dark, shadowy figures moved rapidly across the porch, taking tactical positions. "Fine, I will handle it myself," Patricia snapped forcibly, adjusting her posture. She pulled her shoulders back, lifting her chin to achieve that perfect angle of wealthy suburban condescension. She was preparing to open the door and scold whoever was outside for making such an unseemly racket in her exclusive gated neighborhood. Patricia took exactly 2 steps toward the foyer before the front door was subjected to 3 deafening, violently heavy knocks. The force of the pounding actually rattled the crystal chandelier hanging above the entryway. Federal agents opened the door, a booming, amplified voice commanded from outside. Patricia froze dead in her tracks. Her perfectly manicured hands flew to her mouth, stifling a shocked gasp. "We have a warrant. Open the door immediately," the voice thundered again, carrying a tone of absolute, uncompromising authority that shattered the quiet, insulated sanctuary of the house. Before Patricia could even take another step forward or open her mouth to demand an explanation, the heavy oak door was violently shoved open. The deadbolt splintered with a sharp, echoing crack, sending a shower of wood chips flying across the polished foyer tiles. A flood of individuals poured into the grand entryway. They were not wearing the friendly, recognizable uniforms of the local precinct. They were dressed in stark, dark tactical gear, heavy utility belts, and windbreakers bearing the bright yellow acronyms of federal investigative agencies. They moved with terrifying, practiced precision, fanning out across the foyer, the formal dining room, and the living room in a matter of seconds. The sheer volume of their presence instantly dwarfed the lavish, sprawling dimensions of the house. "Clear the perimeter! Secure all exits!" a voice shouted from the hallway as more agents poured through the shattered front entrance. Patricia shrieked, backing away so fast she nearly tripped over the edge of the Persian rug. She threw her hands in the air, pressing her back flush against the living room wall, as agents marched right past her without offering a single glance of recognition, respect, or sympathy. They were completely indifferent to her expensive silk blouse, her imported decor, and her towering crystal chandeliers. They treated the luxurious home like an active crime scene. They were here for a job, and the Wilsons were simply the targets on their paperwork. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped through the ruined doorway, surveying the absolute chaos of the room with a cold, calculating gaze. He bypassed the weeping Jasmine, who was currently curled into a pathetic ball on the floor amidst the shattered porcelain. He ignored Patricia hyperventilating against the wall, her chest heaving as she watched strangers track dirt across her pristine floors. His eyes scanned the room, sweeping past me, and locked directly onto my father. The man marched across the living room and stepped into the kitchen, his boots heavy on the marble. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather badge holder, flipping it open to reveal a gleaming federal shield. Calvin Wilson, the lead agent, announced, his voice slicing through the frantic noise of the raid like a freshly sharpened blade. My father flinched as if he had been physically struck by a heavy, blunt object. He opened his eyes, his face a sickening shade of gray, and slowly nodded his head. He looked entirely broken, completely stripped of the arrogant pride that had defined his entire existence. "I am Special Agent Miller," the man stated, pulling a thick stack of folded legal documents from his inner pocket. "I am executing a federal warrant for your immediate arrest on multiple counts of wire fraud, bank fraud, and aggravated tax evasion." Patricia let out a guttural, animalistic wail. The sound tore from her throat, raw and utterly unhinged. She tried to rush forward, her hands reaching out toward Calvin in a blind, desperate panic. Agent Miller did not even blink. He raised a single hand, signaling two other agents, who instantly stepped forward, physically blocking Patricia from advancing. They stood like stone walls, completely unmoved by her hysterical tears. Furthermore, Agent Miller continued, turning his hard gaze back to my father, his tone remaining clinical and detached. "We are executing a simultaneous seizure warrant based on irrefutable evidence of massive financial fraud and the deliberate falsification of federal tax returns to secure fraudulent loans. You are hereby ordered to vacate this property. We are immediately seizing this premises and all physical and liquid assets contained within it." Jasmine began to sob hysterically from the floor, clutching her bleeding shoulder as she realized the true depth of their ruin. Patricia collapsed against the blocking agents, her knees entirely giving out as the reality of her total, inescapable destruction crushed the air from her lungs. The pristine, untouchable life she had built on a foundation of lies and theft was being dismantled right in front of her eyes. I stood silently by the marble island, watching the federal agents begin to systematically tag the antique furniture, photograph the assets, and secure the rooms. The illusion was gone. The golden child was a criminal. The proud patriarch was a fraud. And the matriarch, who had valued social standing above her own daughter, was left with absolutely nothing. I clutched the blue leather folder to my side, feeling a profound, quiet peace wash over me. The house of cards had finally collapsed, and I was exactly where I belonged, standing firmly on the outside, watching it burn. Patricia stood against the wall, her chin held high in that familiar imperious angle, waiting for the federal agents to recognize their supposed mistake and apologize for the intrusion. She truly believed her own delusion. She expected Agent Miller to bow his head, acknowledge her undeniable social superiority, and turn his tactical squad directly toward me. Agent Miller did not even blink. He did not care about her country club memberships. He did not care about the charity galas she hosted or the local politicians she invited to her dinner parties. To the federal government, Patricia Wilson was not a pillar of the community. She was simply the primary target listed on a multi-agency seizure warrant for grand larceny, wire fraud, and aggravated tax evasion. "Ma'am, lower your voice and step away from the center of the room." Agent Miller ordered, his tone devoid of any emotion. He did not look at her as a socialite. He looked at her as an obstacle. Patricia's mouth opened, a silent gasp of pure, unadulterated shock escaping her lips. The smirk vanished from her face, instantly replaced by a stark, terrifying realization. Her social capital was completely worthless. The invisible armor she had worn for 3 decades was gone, leaving her entirely exposed. Miller turned his head slightly, speaking into the radio clipped to his tactical vest. "Commence cataloging, seize all listed assets, freeze the perimeter." The living room instantly transformed into a highly coordinated staging ground. Agents moved with terrifying clinical efficiency. They did not shout or make unnecessary noise. They simply began dismantling the Wilson family's manufactured wealth piece by piece. Stacks of flattened, heavy-duty cardboard boxes were carried through the shattered front door. I watched as two agents walked directly over to the dining room wall and began pulling down the expensive imported oil paintings Patricia loved to brag about. Another agent moved into the kitchen, opening the custom cabinetry and methodically boxing up the sterling silver serving sets and crystal glassware. "You cannot do this!" Patricia shrieked, finally finding her voice as an agent walked past her, carrying a stack of her designer throw pillows. "This is my home. You have no right to touch my things." A female agent stepped directly in front of my mother, cutting off her path. The agent held a heavy clear evidence bag in one hand. "Take off the necklace," the agent instructed, her voice flat and professional. "And the rings. Place all jewelry in the bag immediately." Patricia recoiled as if she had been struck. She brought her hands up to protect her throat, her fingers desperately clutching the massive string of authentic South Sea pearls she wore like a badge of honor. "No," Patricia sobbed, her voice cracking as the reality of the situation finally broke through her denial. "Please. These were an anniversary gift. You cannot take my jewelry. They were purchased with fraudulent funds secured against your daughter's stolen identity," the agent replied smoothly, stepping 1 inch closer. "Remove the jewelry. Mrs. Wilson or I will be forced to remove it for you. Do not catch an obstruction charge tonight." Tears streamed down Patricia's face, completely ruining her expensive makeup. Her hands shook violently as she reached behind her neck, fumbling with the intricate gold clasp of the pearls. She dropped the heavy necklace into the plastic bag, followed by her diamond tennis bracelet and her massive engagement ring. The jewelry clattered into the plastic with a dull, pathetic thud. She looked down at her bare, trembling hands, stripped of the very items that defined her worth. Outside the shattered front door, the heavy mechanical grinding of flatbed tow trucks echoed through the quiet suburban night. Through the sheer curtains, the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the driveway. Agents were swarming Trent's prized collection of luxury vehicles. A sleek, matte black Mercedes SUV and a custom imported sports car were already being hitched to the tow cables. The vehicles Trent had used to project the image of a wildly successful real estate mogul were nothing more than heavily financed liabilities seized by the federal government to pay back the victims he had defrauded. Calvin remained slumped against the stainless steel refrigerator, his eyes wide and vacant. He watched the agents empty his house, making no move to stop them. The proud, arrogant deacon of the Greater Hope Ministry had been reduced to an absolute shadow. His entire life's work, his reputation, and his freedom were being boxed up and carried out the front door. Agent Miller finished delegating orders to his team and walked slowly across the kitchen, stopping directly in front of the marble island where I stood. He looked down at the thick stack of tax returns and the forensic accounting spreadsheets I had laid out on the stone surface. Then he looked up and met my gaze. "Kendra Wilson." Agent Miller asked, his tone shifting from authoritative command to professional respect. "Yes," I replied, keeping my voice steady. Miller reached into his jacket and pulled out a separate, heavily redacted file. He cross-referenced a document inside the folder with the spreadsheets I had provided. He closed his file and gave me a firm, definitive nod. "Miss Wilson, your initial tip to the audit division and the subsequent documentation you provided regarding the identity theft were invaluable," Agent Miller said, ensuring his voice carried clearly across the kitchen so my parents could hear every single word. "Because you properly reported the fraudulent use of your Social Security number weeks ago, and because you legally acquired the debt on this property through legitimate channels, you are completely immunized from these proceedings. The asset seizure applies only to the defendants. Your ownership of this estate is recognized and protected." Calvin let out a sharp, ragged gasp. He turned his head, staring at me with a look of absolute, unvarnished horror. He finally understood. I had not just caught them in a lie. I had systematically and legally orchestrated their total destruction while ensuring my own hands remained perfectly clean. I gave Agent Miller a polite nod in return. "Thank you, Agent. The documentation is entirely yours." As Miller gathered the blue folder and the tax returns, the sound of breaking glass echoed from the dining room. Jasmine had managed to pull herself up from the wreckage of the antique credenza. Her designer dress was torn and dusted with white powder from the shattered porcelain. She watched in absolute disbelief as two agents carried a massive stack of her pristine $1,000 handbags out the front door. Her carefully curated life of luxury was evaporating before her eyes. She spun around, her eyes wide and manic, searching the room until she locked onto Trent. Her husband was standing near the living room archway, surrounded by two federal agents who were currently confiscating his phone and wallet. Trent looked pale, sweaty, and entirely pathetic. Jasmine did not care. She refused to accept that the money was gone. She refused to believe that her status as a wealthy elite housewife was over. She lunged forward, her high heels slipping on the hardwood floor, and grabbed Trent violently by the lapels of his tailored suit jacket. "Do something!" Jasmine screamed, shaking him back and forth with surprising strength. The agents tensed, ready to intervene, but Trent held up a shaking hand to wave them off. "Fix this right now, Trent!" Jasmine demanded, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical shriek. "Call your parents! Call them right this second! Tell them what is happening! Have your father wire the money to the agents! Pay them off! We need the lawyers! Call your family and fix this!" Trent stared down at his wife. The man who had spent the last 5 years lecturing me on ambition, corporate strategy, and generational wealth looked absolutely hollow. His jaw clenched, a muscle feathering rapidly in his cheek as he absorbed the sheer, unyielding weight of Jasmine's demands. She shook him again, her fingernails digging into the expensive fabric of his jacket. "Call your father, Trent. Have him wire the money." Trent's facade finally shattered. The arrogant, condescending mask he had worn since the day he married into my family completely disintegrated. He reached up, grabbed Jasmine's wrists, and shoved her away from him with a violent, definitive force. Jasmine stumbled backward, her mouth falling open in shock as she caught her balance. "Stop screaming at me!" Trent roared, his voice echoing over the noise of the federal raid. The sound was raw, bitter, and filled with absolute resentment. Jasmine stared at him, her chest heaving. "Wire the money, Trent. We need your trust fund." Trent let out a dark, humorless laugh that sounded more like a bark of pain. He looked at his wife, his eyes filled with pure, unadulterated loathing. "My parents cut me off 5 years ago because of your psychotic spending," Jasmine, Trent shouted, throwing his hands in the air. The secret he had guarded with his life was finally dragged out into the harsh light of the living room. Jasmine froze, her eyes widening in absolute disbelief. "What are you talking about?" she whispered. "There is no trust fund," Trent screamed, stepping toward her, his face turning a deep, angry red. "There never was. My father took one look at your credit card bills, looked at the hundreds of thousands of dollars you were blowing on designer bags and luxury vacations just to impress your pathetic country club friends, and he completely severed me from the family accounts. He told me he would not let a parasite drain our family wealth. I have not seen a single dime of their money since the day we got married." Jasmine backed away, shaking her head in total denial. "No. No, you have a development firm. You have silent partners. I am a fraud." Jasmine, Trent yelled, his voice cracking with the admission. "The firm went bankrupt 3 years ago. The silent partners were loan sharks I begged for cash just to keep up with your insane demands for a luxury lifestyle. I have been drowning in debt for half a decade trying to keep you happy. I am broke. We are completely, entirely broke." Jasmine stood frozen in the center of the devastated living room. The word broke echoed off the vaulted ceilings, hanging in the air like a physical curse. For a fraction of a second, the sheer magnitude of Trent's confession seemed to short-circuit her brain. Her mouth opened and closed silently. She looked at his cheap, sweating face, then at the federal agents who were currently holding his seized luxury car keys, and finally at the empty spaces on the walls where her expensive art had hung just moments ago. Then the illusion of the golden couple completely shattered into a million irredeemable pieces. Jasmine let out a sound that did not even sound human. It was a feral, blood-curdling shriek of pure, unadulterated rage. She launched herself at Trent with her fingers curled into claws, aiming directly for his face. "You pathetic, worthless liar!" Jasmine screamed, her nails catching the side of his neck and leaving bright red scratches before two federal agents swiftly stepped in, grabbing her arms and pulling her backward. She thrashed wildly against their tactical vests, her designer dress tearing at the seam. You promised me an empire. You told me your family was establishing a trust. You made me look like a fool." Trent did not cower this time. Stripped of his fake wealth and facing imminent federal prison, the polished, sophisticated gentleman vanished. He sneered at her, his face twisting into a mask of pure disgust. "You made yourself look like a fool!" Jasmine Trent roared back, fighting against the agent who was restraining his shoulder. "You spent $400,000 in 2 years on closed spa retreats and vacations we could not afford. You forced me to take out those secondary mortgages just to keep up appearances. And do not act like you are the victim here. You stole from your own father's church to pay off your secret credit cards. I saw the bank transfers." Patricia gasped loudly, her hands flying to her mouth. She looked between her golden daughter and her prize son-in-law as if they had both morphed into monsters. Jasmine thrashed harder, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face in a sweaty, tangled mess. "You absolute hypocrite!" She spat the venom dripping from her words. "Do not stand there and lecture me about stealing when you were siphoning corporate funds to pay for your mistresses." The entire room went dead silent, save for the scratching of the lead agent's pen on his notepad. They were literally handing the federal government a fully confessed timeline of their financial crimes and infidelities on a silver platter. "That is right," Jasmine shrieked, fueled by blind, hysterical vengeance. "I know about the escorts in Miami, Trent. I know about the apartment you rented for your secretary in downtown Boston. You thought I was stupid. You thought because I was spending money I was not tracking where the rest of it went. I maxed out those offshore casino accounts because I knew you were going bankrupt and I needed a safety net." Trent let out a vicious, barking laugh. "A safety net? You call sleeping with your personal trainer and your plastic surgeon a safety net? You are a delusional, narcissistic parasite, Jasmine. You drained my accounts, you drained your parents' accounts, and when the well ran dry, you tried to drain your sister. You deserve everything that is about to happen to you." They continued to scream at each other, their voices echoing through the grand empty halls of the house. They aired every single dirty secret, every disgusting betrayal, every hidden account, and every broken promise. The fairy tale marriage, the pristine country club image, the flawless holiday cards. It was all a spectacular, rotting lie. They despised each other, bound together only by their shared greed and mutual deception. I stood silently by the marble island, watching the absolute carnage unfold. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I had spent 30 years watching my parents worship this toxic, shallow dynamic. I had been cast aside, labeled as socially inept and aggressive simply because I refused to participate in their collective delusion. Now the truth was out, ugly and undeniable, bleeding all over their expensive hardwood floors. Calvin had not moved from the refrigerator. The screaming match between his golden daughter and his white savior son-in-law washed over him like a physical beating. The respectability politics he had weaponized his entire life had completely failed him. He had sacrificed his loyal, capable, independent daughter to protect a family of fraudulent criminals. Slowly, Calvin pushed himself away from the appliance. His legs trembled as he took a step forward. He did not look at Patricia, who was currently weeping hysterically against the wall. He did not look at Jasmine, who was still trying to break free from the federal agents to attack her husband. Calvin walked toward the shattered front entryway. The heavy oak door was splintered and hanging open, exposing the grand foyer to the cool night air. The flashing red, blue, and amber lights of the federal vehicles strobed across his face, highlighting every deep wrinkle and line of defeat. He reached the threshold and looked outside. The noise of the raid, the idling engines of the tow trucks, and the flashing lights had done exactly what Patricia had always feared most. It had drawn an audience. The sprawling manicured lawns of the neighboring estates were no longer empty. Dozens of people had emerged from their mansions. The prestigious country club members, the wealthy local business owners, and several prominent elders from the Greater Hope Ministry were standing in their driveways and on the sidewalks. They were clutching their robes and jackets, their faces illuminated by the harsh glow of the tactical lights. And they were all watching. Calvin stared at them and they stared back. There was no mistaking the expressions on their faces. There was no sympathy. There was only morbid, hungry curiosity and profound judgment. Several neighbors were holding up their smartphones, actively recording the federal agents loading Patricia's designer luggage, and Trent seized financial documents into the back of a black transport van. The hushed, frantic whispers of the crowd carried across the street a symphony of shattered reputations. The Wilson family name was completely dead. The legacy Calvin had built, the pristine, untouchable image he had maintained through lies and manipulation, was burning to the ground in front of the entire community. He had absolutely nothing left to hide behind. Calvin slowly turned his back on the open door. The devastation in his eyes was absolute. He looked at the federal agents boxing up his life. He looked at Trent in handcuffs being read his Miranda rights. He looked at Jasmine, her mascara smeared down her cheeks, screaming obscenities as an agent secured a zip tie around her wrists. Then Calvin turned and looked directly at me. I was the only person in the room not in handcuffs. I was the only person whose assets were legally protected. I was the only person who had walked into this house with my dignity entirely intact. Calvin took a shaky, desperate step toward me, then another. He crossed the kitchen, his posture completely submissive. The proud, booming patriarch was gone, replaced by a terrified, cornered old man. He stopped right in front of me, his chest heaving with panicked breaths. Before I could step back, Calvin reached out and grabbed both of my hands. His palms were clammy and trembling violently. He gripped my fingers with a crushing, pathetic desperation, staring into my eyes with a look of frantic pleading. Kendra Calvin choked out his voice, a raw, broken whisper. Please. I looked down at his shaking hands, feeling absolutely nothing. I did not pull away. I simply stared at him, letting him feel the cold, impenetrable wall he had spent 30 years building between us. Please, Kendra. Calvin begged, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes and tracking down his weathered cheeks. You have to help us. We are your family. We are your blood. You cannot just stand there and let them take us away. I tilted my head, keeping my voice perfectly level. You are under federal arrest for aggravated tax evasion and massive bank fraud, Calvin. I cannot stop the Department of Justice from doing their job. Calvin shook his head frantically, his grip tightening on my hands. No, you do not understand. They are seizing the accounts. They are seizing the cars. We are not going to have a single dime to our names by tomorrow morning. They are going to put Patricia and me in a federal holding cell. We will not survive in there, Kendra. We will not survive it. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a frantic, breathless pitch. The house. Calvin pleaded, his eyes wide and manic. The agent said you legally own the debt on the house. That means you control the asset. You have the equity. Kendra, please, if you just sign over the deed to the house back to us, we can use the equity to post bail. We can hire defense attorneys. We can fix this. You have to sign it over. Please, we are your blood. I stared down at Calvin's hands. His grip was clammy, desperate, and trembling with the sheer terror of a man who had finally run out of lies to sell. For my entire life, those hands had pushed me away. They had waved off my accomplishments, signed checks to cover up Jasmine's catastrophic mistakes, and pointed toward the door whenever I dared to ask for genuine affection. Now those same hands were clinging to me like a life preserver in a violently churning ocean. I did not flinch. I did not pull away immediately. I simply let him feel the absolute impenetrable coldness radiating from my silence. I wanted him to absorb the reality that the daughter he had spent 3 decades discarding was now holding the physical deed to his freedom. Slowly, deliberately, I peeled his damp fingers off my wrists. I stepped back, severing the physical contact, and let the distance between us stretch into a vast, unbridgeable chasm. I reached into my tailored blazer and opened the small inner pocket. My fingers brushed against the cool, heavy metal of a silver fountain pen. I pulled it out and held it up into the strobing amber light filtering through the shattered front door. The reaction in the room was instantaneous. The vicious, screaming match between Jasmine and Trent died in the middle of a sentence. Jasmine wiped a streak of smeared mascara from her cheek and stared at the pen. Trent stopped fighting against the federal agents holding his arms, his chest heaving as his eyes locked onto the silver barrel. By the far wall, Patricia actually stopped hyperventilating. A sudden, sickening wave of relief washed over her ruined face. She pushed herself off the wall, smoothing her torn silk blouse with trembling hands. She let out a long, ragged exhale that sounded exactly like victory. They all stopped breathing. They all stared at the pen. In their minds, the natural order of the universe was snapping back into place. The momentary panic of the federal raid was just a terrifying detour, but the destination remained exactly the same. They fully expected the lifetime scapegoat to cave to the ultimate pressure of family loyalty. They believed with every fiber of their narcissistic being that I was about to sacrifice my own leverage, my own money, and my own safety to bail them out of their self-inflicted destruction. Just sign on the bottom line, Kendra. Patricia whispered, her voice regaining a fraction of its old dripping condescension. We will sort out the details tomorrow morning after the banks open. Just sign the deed over to your father so we can get these awful people out of our house. I looked at the silver pen resting between my fingers. You gave me this pen, Dad? I said, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal calm that cut cleanly through the ambient noise of the federal agents tearing the house apart. Do you remember when Calvin swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically between the pen and the property deed resting on the marble island? He shook his head slightly, too paralyzed by fear to speak. You gave it to me the day I earned my master's degree. I continued, stepping slowly around the perimeter of the kitchen island. You handed me this exact silver pen, not to write a congratulatory card, but to sign a non-disclosure agreement. You demanded that I take the high road and stay completely silent about Trent embezzling from the church building fund to pay off Jasmine's luxury car leases. Jasmine flinched, taking a sudden step backward, as if the memory physically burned her. Take the high road, Kendra, I repeated, echoing his exact tone from years ago. That is what you told me every single time I begged for basic respect. You forced me to take the high road and stay perfectly quiet so you could protect your flawless community image. When I won the state debate championship, you told me to minimize my accomplishment because Jasmine had just failed her college entrance exams, and you did not want her to feel inadequate. I stopped pacing and locked eyes with my mother. When my first business venture was completely destroyed by a vendor, I came to you crying, asking for a fraction of the support you gave Trent. I said, my words striking Patricia like physical blows. You told me to silence my trauma to keep up appearances. You told me that my failure was embarrassing the family brand. You demanded that I suppress every single emotion I had, just so Jasmine could shine brighter. I was never a daughter to you. I was just the shock absorber for your toxic, fraudulent lives. Patricia opened her mouth to argue, but the words died in her throat. She looked at the federal agents who had just finished boxing up her prized collection of crystal stemware. She looked at the reality of her shattered world and desperately tried to play her final card. We are your family, Patricia cried out, her voice cracking into a shrill, desperate plea. You cannot let them take us away. You have the money. You have the house. You can save us. Hurry up and sign the paper, Kendra. Jasmine snapped, her old entitlement suddenly flaring up as she watched an agent carry her racks of designer shoes toward the front door. They are touching my things. Sign the deed over so Dad can pay them off. I looked at Jasmine. I looked at Trent, who was currently sweating through his ruined designer suit. I looked at Patricia, clinging to her delusions of grandeur, and finally I looked at Calvin. They did not want forgiveness. They did not feel an ounce of remorse for stealing my identity or defrauding the government. They just wanted their bailout. They wanted their scapegoat to lay down on the tracks one final time so they could drive their luxury cars right over my back. I raised the silver pen. I brought my thumb down on the top mechanism. Click. The sharp metallic snap of the pen echoed like a gunshot in the silent kitchen. Calvin leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the marble island, his eyes shining with greedy, desperate hope. He watched my hand move toward the property deed. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully manipulated his unloved daughter into sacrificing her entire future to save his pride. I placed my hand on the thick official deed to the sprawling estate. I looked Calvin directly in the eye, ensuring he could see the absolute chilling void where my familial love used to be. Then I picked up the deed, slid it smoothly back into my blue leather folder, and zipped it completely shut. The collective gasp from my family sucked the remaining oxygen out of the room. Patricia let out a strangled shriek. Calvin's arms gave out, his elbows buckling against the marble counter as the last shred of his hope was entirely extinguished. Jasmine began to scream, thrashing against the agents restraining her, demanding that I open the folder and give them the house. I ignored their hysterics. I kept the silver pen in my right hand and reached into the secondary pocket of my folder. I pulled out a single, freshly printed document bearing a bright red legal header. I slapped it down onto the marble surface. "I am not taking the high road anymore," I announced, my voice ringing with absolute unshakable authority. "I am taking the house." I leaned over the marble island and pressed the tip of the silver pen to the signature line at the bottom of the page. I signed my name with a sharp, heavy flourish, the ink bleeding dark and permanent into the paper. I picked up the document and turned to face Special Agent Miller, who had been quietly observing the entire exchange from the archway. I handed the paper directly to the federal agent. "This is a formal declaration of criminal trespass and an immediate eviction notice," I stated clearly, my words dropping like an anvil onto the remaining members of the Wilson family. "Because this property is now solely under my legal ownership, and because these individuals used my premises to conduct federal wire fraud, I am authorizing the Department of Justice to remove them from my property immediately. They do not have 30 days. They do not have 30 minutes. Get them out of my house." Special Agent Miller takes the freshly signed document from my hand, his sharp eyes scanning the heavy ink of my signature. He gives a curt professional nod, officially recognizing my absolute legal authority over the estate. But before he can fold the paper into his evidence binder, I pull a secondary copy from my blue leather folder. I turn back to Calvin, who is still gripping the edge of the marble island, as if the ground beneath him has turned to liquid. I step forward and press the crisp document flat against Calvin's chest. He flinches, his trembling hands reflexively coming up to grasp the white paper. He looks down at it, his vision swimming as he struggles to comprehend the stark, undeniable legal jargon. It is an immediate eviction notice. 30 days, I say, my voice completely devoid of any pity. The sound cuts cleanly through the chaotic noise of the federal agents dismantling his empire. 30 days to gather whatever personal belongings the government does not seize. Though depending on what the feds find in those offshore accounts today, the state might give you a new room for free. Calvin's mouth works silently. He looks at Patricia, who is openly weeping as a female agent meticulously catalogs her diamond watches, and then at Jasmine, who is sitting on the hardwood floor, handcuffed and entirely broken. The reality of their destitution is absolute. They have no money, no leverage, and absolutely no power over me. I do not wait for his response. I turn my back on the wreckage of the Wilson family and walk deliberately toward the shattered front entryway. My heels click against the hardwood floor with a steady, rhythmic finality. I reach the grand foyer and pause. Hanging above the sweeping mahogany staircase is the massive family portrait Patricia had commissioned 5 years ago. It is a masterpiece of manufactured perfection. Calvin stands tall and righteous in the center. Patricia beams beside him, draped in imported silk. Jasmine and Trent are positioned prominently in the foreground, the glowing golden couple radiating success and superiority. And then there is me. I am deliberately placed in the back position, slightly behind Trent's shoulder, my face half hidden in the shadows of the studio lighting. Patricia had explicitly instructed the photographer to blur my features, ensuring I faded seamlessly into the background so as not to distract from the main attraction. For years, that portrait was a daily, painful reminder of my exact worth in this house. Now it is just a piece of trash left behind in a property that belongs entirely to me. The raid has stretched through the darkest hours of the night, and as I stand in the foyer, the first pale rays of dawn begin to break over the manicured lawns. The harsh, pulsing glare of the police cruisers mixes with the soft morning light, illuminating the utter devastation of the estate. I look back over my shoulder one last time. My parents are completely surrounded by tactical agents packing their fraudulent lives into heavy cardboard boxes. Their kingdom is gone. Their wealth is a mirage. Their respectability is entirely dead. "You spent 30 years trying to make me invisible," I say, ensuring my voice carries across the foyer loud and clear enough to pierce through their despair. Calvin and Patricia both look up. Their faces are ashen, their eyes hollow with the terrifying realization of what they have lost. Congratulations, I state, my tone absolute and unyielding. I am finally gone. I step over the splintered threshold and walk out into the sunlight. Fast forward 6 months. The sharp, crisp scent of fresh espresso fills the air. I am sitting in my corner office surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that overlook the bustling downtown skyline. The gold lettering on the frosted glass door reads, Kendra Wilson, Principal Director. It is my own private forensic accounting firm, built entirely on my own merit, funded by my own brilliance, and untainted by a single drop of stolen money. I sit at my polished mahogany desk reviewing the final closing documents for a massive corporate audit. The numbers align perfectly. The financial discrepancies have been hunted down and eradicated. The chaotic mess left behind by corrupt executives has been systematically dismantled by my team. It is satisfying, clean, and entirely under my control. In the corner of my office, a flat-screen television monitor plays the local news on mute. A flashing red banner scrolling across the bottom of the screen catches my attention. I pick up the remote and raise the volume slightly. The screen shows the concrete steps of the federal courthouse. Jasmine and Trent are standing before a throng of aggressive reporters. The golden couple looks completely unrecognizable. Trent is wearing an ill-fitting cheap suit, his posture stooped, his hair thinning from the sheer stress of the federal indictment. Jasmine looks hollowed out. Her designer clothes are gone, replaced by a drab, off-the-rack blouse. Her face is drawn, her eyes darting nervously away from the flashing cameras. The news anchor's voice is crisp and unsympathetic, detailing the final sentencing. They are facing years in federal prison for wire fraud, identity theft, and gross embezzlement. Their empire of lies has traded them luxury cars for concrete cells. The broadcast cuts to a secondary segment covering the fallout of the Greater Hope Ministry scandal. The reporter stands outside a dilapidated low-income housing complex on the outskirts of the city. Calvin and Patricia are briefly visible through a murky apartment window. They are living in a tiny, cramped one-bedroom unit completely stripped of their wealth. The church board excommunicated them the day after the raid. Their wealthy country club friends blocked their numbers. The society they sacrificed their souls to impress discarded them the second the federal indictments went public. They are entirely alone, living out their remaining years in disgraced poverty. I watch the screen for a moment longer, feeling a profound, quiet peace. There is no anger left. There is no bitterness. They are simply strangers paying the ultimate price for their own catastrophic greed. I press the mute button on the remote and turn my attention back to my desk. Resting near my keyboard is the worn blue leather folder. I reach out and trace my fingers over the frayed edges. This folder has been my constant companion. It carried 20 years of survival. It held the forensic spreadsheets, the hidden bank statements, the forged loan documents, and the undeniable proof of my family's betrayal. It was the armor I used to protect myself when the people who were supposed to love me tried to destroy my life. I do not need the armor anymore. I pick up the heavy folder and walk over to the industrial paper shredder sitting next to the large window. I press the power button and the machine hums to life with a steady mechanical whir. I open the blue cover and pull out the first stack of documents. The fake tax returns, the fraudulent mortgage applications bearing my forged signature, the desperate, incriminating emails between Trent and Jasmine. I feed the pages into the hungry metal teeth of the machine. The blades catch the paper, grinding the lies into tiny, irredeemable ribbons. I feed the next stack and then the next. The mechanical grinding sound is a symphony of closure. With every page that disappears into the shredder, the weight on my shoulders becomes lighter. The toxic grip of the Wilson family completely dissolves into dust. I feed the final document into the blades and watch the very last shred of paper vanish. I turn off the machine and look out the window at the bright, vibrant city skyline. The debt is paid, the past is erased, the future is finally mine. True family is defined by mutual respect and unwavering support, not merely by shared bloodlines. When those closest to you consistently minimize your worth, manipulate your kindness, or betray your trust for their own gain, the most powerful response is never seeking their validation. Instead, true strength lies in walking away and building your own success. Emotional and financial independence are your greatest shields against manipulation. You must learn to set unbreakable boundaries and realize that your inherent value is never determined by someone else's inability to see it. Share your own experiences with setting difficult family boundaries in the comments below, and do not forget to like and subscribe for more empowering stories of resilience.